서울시 교육청이 주관하고 있는
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. From the Seoul Office of Education, we are here today to discuss changes in society and education. So now we are going to begin this international webinar. My name is Yong, from a professor at the Seoul University of Education, and it is a great pleasure for me to meet everyone from both home and abroad. Now, since COVID-19, we are experiencing completely new things, a new era. So we have seen the government give disaster relief funds to people of Korea. So we have never seen this before. And also, according to many overseas, they say that the sporting events, which had continued even during the World War, have now come to a stop. So we see that COVID-19 has really brought about large and deep repercussions to everyone around the world. Now today, this webinar will be conducted in sessions 1 and 2. So across these two sessions, we will be discussing the changes in our society and also the changes to the education and how education should change in response to the changes in the society. So now with that, let me first introduce the speakers in session 1. First, I have the Superintendent Hee-Yeon of the Seoul Office of Education. We have Professor Jin-Wook from Chung-Ang University, Professor Yong of Kongju University. Now, Professor Yong, he is also the president of the National Institute on Environment. And we also have Mr. Hong Jung-min, the director of Hunet, which is an education specialized institute. So I'm sure that he will also tell us a lot about the new trends in education, including online education. And we also have Kwon Soonjung from the Education Policy Institute under the Seoul Office of Education. And also we have from overseas, Mr. Jannik Mortensen from Denmark. So are you here? Jannik, are you here? So Mr. Mortensen is the policy advisor at the Danish Association of School Leaders. And Mr. Mortensen, can you just briefly introduce your association? 지금 덴마크에서는 16세까지 이제 학생들이 있는데요. 그런데 이 덴마크 학교 리더 연합회의 경우에는 거의 모든 학교가 다 참여를 하고 있습니다.
본래 오늘 행사에는 학교 리더 연합회 회장님이신
So today
클라우스
we were going to be joined by the president of the association, Mr. Claus Hjortdal, but then he was held back due to urgent matters. Now, last but not least, we have Mr. Lim Tin Sung. Do you see us? Do you see us, Mr. Lim?
선생님은 VR을 활용한 교육 콘텐츠 개발 그리고 도서관.
So he is in charge of the library innovation, among other things, at the National Library of Singapore. All right, now with that, we are going to begin our discussion. Now, those who have taken part in the pre-recorded presentations, so we also have Professor Jin-Wook and Professor Yong. They were especially, their presentations were especially useful. So now in the pre-recorded presentations, there were discussions about the trustworthiness of the government and also the public's impact and also the climate change and how, so we were talking about the changes related to COVID-19, but I'm sure that there are some other changes that are related to COVID-19, some issues or changes that are pertinent to COVID-19. So I wonder what these other changes could be. So now then, what about Ms. Kwon? Now, I would say that there are two issues that come up to my mind right now. So first are changes in culture, because now we are now really seeing the online world becoming our everyday life. But then rather than this being a natural part of the course or voluntary, it has become more of a imposed thing on us. So this means that it has become something that we must do. So then this kind of online forum or online classes and online learning. So I see that people now, of course, it has been imposed from the outside, but then now people are now following them more or less. But then I see that there are still some offline practices that we are maintaining. So, for example, let's say if it is going to be about like offline video, then in terms of the time or the schedule, then oftentimes they are not really clear. So, for example, sometimes we have to attend the meeting at night or on the weekend, then work-life balance becomes very difficult. So I would say that there are these unintended changes that have been brought on to our culture or our everyday lives. Then also, in terms of the interactions or the communication, oftentimes online communication, oftentimes they are just one directional. So we also have to make sure that we can overcome them. And also, especially on the online world, we are not just all consumers. We can also become the producers and creators. So we also need to think more about the legal framework so as to make sure that everyone can be users or creators online safely. And also, I have become more interested in the educational gap. Now, of course, Professors Hong and Professor Shin, they have also discussed them. But then now, today, the children, they are the digital native, and now we have to think about how we are going to educate them. So, for example, the digital literacy or the ICT literacy that we have been discussing for some time, I believe that it is time for us to renew our focus on them. And I think many of the needs that are arising today, now they are really in line with what also with the needs of the digital era as well. So, for example, this kind of digital literacy. So, I would say that this is in line with what Professor Shin talked about, the broad literacy. So, I would say that this new curriculum that was proposed a few years ago, I would say that that was actually quite in line with what we are dealing with today. All right, thank you very much for the talk. And then now, I would like to then ask Mr. Mortensen. Now, I'm sure that Denmark is also grappling with COVID-19. So what are the changes that you are seeing in the Danish society? Then also personally, in the past 4 to 3 months, what have been going through your mind under this COVID-19 situation? 저희도 마찬가지인데요. 일단 먼저 첫 단계로는 뭐 두려움이라거나 또는 고립, 격리 이제 이러한 데서 시작이 되면서 이제 그러다가 다시 이제 사회의 활동을 재개한다라는 것이 굉장히 어려운 과정을 거치면서 이루어지고 있는 것이죠. 이러한 게 사실 굉장히 어려운 단계다라고 할 수 있겠습니다. 그리고 또 사실 뭐 어떠한 실질적인 변화가 있었는가를 말씀드리자면은 지금까지의 경험을 통해서 보면 우리의 다양한 시스템이나 제도에 대해서도 영향을 미치고 있고 또 인간관계에도 물론 크나큰 영향을 미치는 것을 볼 수가 있습니다. 또 그런가 하면 사회적 불평등이나 또 이런 다양한 부작용이 있다고 할 수가 있겠습니다. 그래서 지금 코로나로 인해서 사람들 사이에서의 거리가 발생을 하게 되는 것이고 또 고립되는 사람들이 더 증가를 하고 있고요. 이러한 상황에서 우리가 어떻게 하면 시스템을 개선하거나 또는 강화를 하여서 이런 취약계층에게 지원을 할 것인가에 대해서도 고민을 하고 있습니다. 그래서 뭐 북유럽 국가들 그래도 또 그 외에도 다른 유럽 국가들과 마찬가지로 저희가 이러한 문제에 대해서 대처를 해 나가면서 또 이러한 변화에 대응을 해 나가면서 또 인간의 지속적인 발전을 위해서 무엇을 할 수 있는지를 계속 고민해 나아가고 있는 상황입니다.
예, 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much.
미스터 몬텐슨 선생님 말씀을
Having listened to your statement, it seems that what your concerns are in Denmark are quite similar to our concerns in Korea. If you have seen the pre-recorded presentation videos, you have probably seen that from Professor Shin's presentation, he examined the Korean situation quite a bit. Having said that, I wonder about the impact of COVID-19 on the relationship among countries. During the last 2 to 3 decades, we had the mega flow of globalization. And so will this flow be impacted? And within this change, what will be the path of education around the world? Maybe we can start from Superintendent Cho from the perspective of a social scientist. Well, I have had the opportunity to study Professor Shin's material, and I'm sure that it was quite inspiring to many people. Personally, recently, due to the COVID-19 situation, I have been having a completely new perspective of globalization, and I have concerns on how to have a better understanding of the current phenomenon. Personally, concerning the existing flow of globalization, I believe that we need to have deep reflections about globalization. It's an opportunity to be inspired to have reflections on globalization. Thus far, we did have a certain type of globalization, mainly centered around multinational companies, and it was an extractive globalization. It was a globalization focused on the market and large companies, and it was a globalization of integrating production and distribution. And so those were the characteristics of the existing globalization. That was a mega flow, and we thought that that was a given, something that we had to live with. But with the COVID-19, I believe that we have been driven into a situation where we rethink the mainstream of globalization. It's an opportunity for us to give new light to inspiration and imagination on that have been marginalized from the main flow of globalization. In the past, globalization was centered around companies, and so that would mean that the strength of the country would be weakened. But now we see the return of the strength of countries. And just like Mr. Kim has mentioned, due to COVID-19 in Korea, we have experienced disaster relief funds that are almost as high as basic income. And so it's a new type of state that we are experiencing. And the safety of homes and families are now being guaranteed by the state, which is a new experience that we are having due to COVID-19. Furthermore, concerning globalization, on a personal note, I think we have thought on the global level we always thought from the perspective of globalists, whereas there are also nationalists. So we always had globalists and nationalists. And what we thought of nationalists we thought that they were people who focused on the state. And I also believe that there's a third type, which is localist, who focus on the local economy, the local communities. So we had three flows of thought: the globalist, nationalist, and localist. In the past, I think globalists were focused on just companies. They were company-centered globalists, and that was thought of as the mainstream. But now we have a new alternative view of globalists. And we talk about the return of the state. And so that would mean that a somewhat nationalist perspective is in the limelight because we're refocusing on the function of the state. And we also have the localists. For example, masks and other necessary products for our everyday lives, we need to be self-sufficient, just like Professor Lee always emphasizes. We need to have self-sufficient local economies because we have social distancing, we have quarantines, and so lockdowns, and furthermore, we need to make sure that in these situations, we need to have self-sufficient local economies and local communities. But all of these thoughts were lost and thought of something of the past because of the mainstreaming of globalists, but it's coming back into the limelight. I think we can extend this into education. Education was focused on becoming number one. It was about strengthening global competitiveness. But with COVID-19, we are giving new thought to alternative inspirations and alternative imagination. And so we are trying to move away from what has been marginalized due to globalization of the past. We are finding alternative values, alternative policies that can be reflected in the execution of government policies. And so these are the changes that we have been experiencing. So those are my personal opinions. In 2008, we had the economic crisis, and that actually gave us a turning point to rethink about globalization. And COVID-19 is another fundamental opportunity. Professor Lee, do you have anything to add? Well, since I am a specialist in environmental education, so I'm always interested in COVID-19 and the impact on climate change. I think what we are focusing is anxiety. Some people use the term climate anxiety. So the more people become anxious, it's more difficult to be considerate of others. And if you're anxious today, it's difficult to think about tomorrow. That's why more people in the US are owning guns, and they are trying to buy their necessities in bulks. It's all from anxieties. Well, in Korea, our tradition says that if people are going hungry and you are found to store food in your warehouses, then they would not hold those people who hit you criminally accountable in the past. And so I think that gives us room for thought. The Disease Control Center has shown us the importance of scientific credibility and communication based on scientific facts. We have many YouTubers these days, and so many people are broadcasters themselves. And so that actually could trigger more anxiety within society. And so we need to think about how we can respond to anxiety and resume our feeling of being considerate of others, not only on a personal level, but on a state level as well. Professor Lee, you talked about the heart of people, and these are fundamental issues. And Superintendent Cho talked about the macro issue about globalization. What about Professor Shin? What are your thoughts? Well, concerning globalization, I think the starting point is that globalization is not from a single perspective. There are many perspectives that can start off the dialogue on globalization. Well, in order to make sure that there's not the expansion of COVID-19, we start to build barriers, and that would be the first thought that we have. But I think it's double-sided. On one side, we need to see that there is a severing and hindering of global chains, but at the same time, we see the increase of digitization, and digitization will become a part of our everyday lives, and this will be accelerated. So, for example, the movement of people, the movement of services and goods, much of that has been hindered, and it's very difficult to expect that we will go back to how things were before COVID-19. But as we are experiencing from this international webinar, there are efforts to overcome these material, physical restraints, and we are becoming adjusted to this new environment. From a political perspective, some people say that we will go back to nationalism and protectionism. Of course, from some aspects, that is correct. But sometimes we call this era the era of fortress countries. And so I believe that although people do talk about these issues, that's not where we will go, but rather we will come up with alternatives to overcome the current restraints through international cooperation, because we know the importance of international cooperation to overcome future challenges such as the next disease to come. Thank you very much. On a personal note, from your previous presentation, you talked about the changes of awareness among people, and it will mean that we will emphasize democracy, impartiality, and trust. But at the same time, there will be also another emphasis on competition, individualism, and materialism. And this is being reported in many countries around the world. And so could you explain what these phenomena mean? Could we start with Dr. Kwon? What is the meaning of this phenomenon?
Now, when I first saw this question, I was wondering where to begin. Because now for my generation, those in their 30s and 40s, so based on our experience of education, then can we really see them as contradictions to each other? Because we just talked about globalization, but then now, beneath globalization, there is the capitalist ideology. And that ideology is always paired with democracy. Now, for my generation, that is the world that we were born, and that is when we spent our school years. So for us to separate between the public and the private, it's very difficult, especially in education, for us to separate between the public and the private. That means that I probably have to begin by rejecting my own experience, because we do know that education is the school is an area of public education. But then on the private side, I mean, we are so used and we are so immersed in private education as well. Like, for example, learning the piano and going to private academies. So yes, of course, we do realize that it can be a problem in terms of social equality. But then now, as a part of our culture or as part of our society, it's very difficult for us to deny them. So then, given this situation, then for my generation, then yes, on one hand, we have also made private choices as we accumulate in our cultural capital. And so that is not to thrive more than others, but just to maintain the status quo. And then now, on top of that, there is the current anxiety as well as COVID-19. So this means that the anxiety is getting magnified. And then now, under this sense of anxiety, then are we going to make some irrational choices only based on short-term vision? So perhaps now, that is one issue that we have to overcome right now, because I think that could be a problem at a later date. And then also in terms of such individual choices and also the materialism. So, I mean, we are used to that kind of culture, but then now, as we also went through in Korea, the candlelight revolution, we also are now becoming more aware of social justice and equality, but then also we haven't really seen personally how that is going to benefit us. So yes, when we have this kind of COVID-19 situation, then we would all hoard masks, we would all hoard food. And then now, when we get used to this, then we also want to get prettier masks and we also want to get more exotic food. So I think there's always this tendency toward personal choices and the personal area. So perhaps that is similar to what Professor Hargrove has mentioned. So I think that is probably in line with that. And then now, Professor Shin, what did you think? Well, I did think that this was contradictory because, yes, as Dr. Kwon has just mentioned, now for the young generation, for them, they have all seen these values exist all at once. Now, this is not something new. I mean, they have been in existence for such a long time, for decades now. But then now, why they are contradictory? Because now for the communities, so when we have to make decisions for the community, we cannot make a decision only in one interest or in one perspective. So then the question is, how are we going to make a more balanced decision, or are we just going to rely on individual voices? So I do not believe that it is possible for us to go for both the community and the individuals at the same time. So now then, today, in a crisis situation, decisions for the community, the group interest, I would say, are more important than ever. But then the fact that we still see such group behavior and the individual behavior at the same time, I would say that they are still quite interesting and contradictory. Now then, why that would be? I think that has to do with the two-dimensionality of the situation today, because on one hand we see this virus separating people, isolating people, and also making us more wary of others. So yes, on one hand it is making people more wary and cautious of others, but then also at the same time, in terms of the public area, so the public sector, the public resources and the public assets have become more important than ever before. So then looking at these results, what I have thought was that now, since COVID-19, where are people's thoughts or perceptions going to be headed? So rather than such an observer, I believe that there is actually some competing forces at work, because COVID-19 can actually push our society in either direction, into more individual way or to a more public path. So then I believe what we need to do now is how we are going to really try to steer this into a better direction and try to minimize the side effects. Right, I believe that yes, there are several aspects to this, because Professor Hargreave also talked about whether it is imposed from the outside, or I think what is important now is the sense of anxiety, the sense of crisis. But now, on one hand, how we respond to this crisis. So for example, if a state were able to keep us safe from the crisis, then their trustworthiness goes up all of a sudden. Now, on the other hand, not just the public or the state support, but let's say in this crisis, no, we still have to survive on our own to a certain extent, because we are also isolated from each other. So yes, we do see this duality, and I believe that right now we are at the crossroads on whether, so in what direction we will actually be headed. Yes, I believe that that is a challenge common to all of us. Right now then, regarding the digital, so it was mentioned that the digital is driving globalization, and then now Mr. Hong Jung-min, now in his presentation, he talked about the online education in the post-COVID era. And now in Singapore and Denmark, now since COVID-19, I wonder how the school education has been taking place since COVID-19 in these two countries, and also how online education is being utilized. So then perhaps Mr. Lin can share with us the situation in Singapore.
진행을 하는 학습으로 전환이 되었습니다.
If we talk about this home-based learning,
가정
what is it,
학습이라고
right? So
말씀을 드리는 것은
instructions are being pushed
수업이
out to the students
학생들에게
through either
온라인 플랫폼을 통해서
materials and
전달이
right.
되고
So for the students in primary and secondary schools,
학생들 중 일부는
student learning space. So the students have been already been using such platform.
다양한 플랫폼을 통해서 온라인 형태의 수업을 진행을 한 상황입니다.
With this COVID-19, what happened is that everyone went through this
코로나
crash
사태
course
이후에
where learning was being pushed out in full time through this platform as well as
모두가
other forms. Okay, it will be like online teaching, through
학교
Zoom,
수업에 살펴보면 도서관에서는 저희가 모든 것의 형태를 바꿔놓고 있습니다. 예전에는 사서들이 물리적으로 도서관에 사람들이 모여서 모인 사람들에게 여러 가지 강연도 하고 발표도 하는 일을 많이 했었습니다. 코로나 사태로 인해서 서로 만날 수가 없고 이렇게 사람들이 모이는 형태의 강연을 할 수가 없지만 온라인으로는 가능하다라는 것을 깨닫고 있습니다. 이미 갖고 있었던 영상 자료들을 페이스북을 통해서 공유하는 것도 진행을 했지만 이것은 한 가지 방법에 불과합니다. 그 외에도 여러 가지 동영상들을 짧게 나누어서 제공을 하기도 합니다. 제가 홍 소장님께서 발표하신 내용에서도 이런 내용이 있었다라는 것을 알고 있는데요. 좀 더 짧은 영상으로 나누어서 제공을 하기도 했습니다. 저희 국립도서관에서는 이와 더불어서 마치 집에서 편안하게 이야기를 듣는 것과 같은 강연을 들을 수 있도록 사서들이 자신의 집에서 자신의 책을 소개한다든지 이런 새로운 형태의 강의도 제공을 했습니다. 그런데 말씀드린 것처럼 좀 더 짧게 진행을 하기도 하고 좀 더 편안한 환경에서 새로운 형태의 발표를 시도를 해보았습니다. 앞으로 미래에도 새로운 온라인 형태의 제품들이 제공이 될 것이라고 생각이 되는데요. 편안한 환경, 또 공식적인 환경, 다양한 형태의 강연이 진행될 것으로 예상이 됩니다.
예, 고맙습니다. 아마 우리 한국에서도 아이들이 없는 학교에 나오지 못하는 아이들에게
So for the children who are not going to school, self-directed learning will be very important. And I guess that was very important for Singapore as well. What about Denmark? Mr. Mortensen, could you share with us the situation of school education in Denmark ever since COVID-19? 네, 말씀드리겠습니다. 우선 모든 학생들이 등교를 중지하고 락다운이 이루어졌습니다. 그 이후에 2주 내지 한 달이 지났을 때 정부에서 발표한 것은 6세부터 12세 사이의 학생들은 등교를 하되 학교의 일과를 줄이고 나머지 학생들은 등교를 안 했습니다. 그런데 지난 4주 동안 그 외의 학생들도 등교를 하기 시작했습니다. 그런데 일과를 좀 줄여서 등교를 해서 하루에 3, 4시간 정도 등교를 하고 있습니다. 처음에는 일주일에 한두 번만 등교를 했었습니다. 그래서 사회를 다시 열고 또 코로나 사태가 더욱더 확산되지 않도록 하는 것이 가장 중요한 목표로 운영이 된 것이죠. 덴마크 정부에서는 학교들을 지원하기 위해서 명확한 규정을 세우고 사회적 거리두기나 손 씻기와 관련된 정확한 규정을 만들어서 학교에 전달을 하고 학교와도 계속해서 소통을 하고 있는데 학교에서 교육과 관련된 부분들이 아니고 이러한 코로나 사태와 관련된 지침이 상당히 많이 전달된 것으로 생각이 됩니다. 또한 영감을 줄 수 있는 여러 자료들도 공유를 하고 있지만 선생님들 같은 경우에도 새로운 열정이 생기고 있고 새로운 창의력이 생기고 있는 시기인 것 같습니다. 그래서 학생들에게 가르치는 방식을 새롭게 생각해 볼 수 있는 계기가 되었고 또 과거에 했던 활동들 중에 할 수 없는 활동들이 생겨나고 또 그렇기 때문에 새로운 활동들을 다시 한번 생각해보는 그러한 계기가 된 것 같습니다. 정치인들과 정책 입안자들이 어떻게 학교 교육의 질을 미래에 보장할 수 있는지를 생각해봐야 하는데요. 선생님들이 열정적으로 새롭게 생각하고 있는 것들을 계속해서 지원해드려야 할 텐데 덴마크 같은 경우에는 지난 몇 년 동안 학교 리더들과 교사들 간에 학교 내에서 이루어지고 있는 시험이라든지 평가에 대해서 많은 논의가 이루어졌습니다. 독서의 양이 줄어들고 있고 또 지금 현재 개별 학생들에게 또 개별 학생들의 발전에 기여하지 못하고 있는 부분들이 있다는 것에 대해서 많은 논의가 있어 왔는데 이를 바탕으로 해서 지난 몇 개월 동안 코로나 사태에서 새로운 상황 속에서 미래에 더 나은 시스템을 만들기 위해서 많은 논의가 이루어지는 계기가 되었습니다. 미래 교육을 생각해 보면 온라인 교육은 물론 많은 장점을 갖고 있습니다. 학생들이 자신이 원하는 시간에 로그인을 해서 온라인 형태로 수업을 받을 수 있다는 것도 장점이 될 수가 있고 또한 학생들이 갖고 있는 여러 장단점들을 배려할 수 있는 형태의 교육이라고도 생각합니다. 그렇지만 어떠한 종류의 교육이 온라인에 적합하고 어떠한 교육은 같이 모여서 해야 하느냐를 또 생각해 봐야 하는 시점이라고 생각합니다. 덴마크는 21세기식 역량에 집중하고 있는데 예를 들어서 인터넷을 사용할 수 있는 능력이라든지 미디어를 사용할 수 있는 능력 이런 것들을 온라인으로 교육할 수가 있겠죠. 그렇지만 창의력이라든지 협업이라든지 이러한 측면의 발전을 위해서는 다른 형태의 온라인 외의 교육 형태가 필요할 수가 있겠습니다. 그래서 이러한 부분들에 대한 논의가 활발하게 이루어지고 있습니다.
네, 고맙습니다. 홍정래 소장님께서 굉장히 흥미로운 발전을 해주셨는데
Now, Director Hong also gave a very interesting presentation, so I would say that there would be other countries aside from these two that would also be having very interesting innovation. So could you give us some examples? Yes, I believe that in most countries, education has gone online. So, for example, the real-time online education through Zoom, it has become really a very interesting topic. And also, for example, in the US, they also have what's called the bring your own device. So fortunately, they already had these devices in the schools. So of course, there are some differences in the income between the income classes. But then I would say that still, like cities like New York or Switzerland, they were able to deal with this quite well. And I think Spain is also having a similar experience. So they have the e-learning, so they would stream their education contents online for a few hours. So I would say that right now we really have no other choice than to have online education. And since I am coming from the corporate side, now yes, I see that on the corporate side, the working from home culture is much more prevalent today. Now looking at the businesses, then now before 2005, now the offline work or offline education, so now it was like close to 99%. But then these days, it's now close to 32%, like online. And then also, and so the offline is only like 32%. And also in the Middle East, we see that the offline work is only 33%. So we see that many more countries are now using these two modalities in parallel. And also because I also went to the teachers' university, I also have some teachers who are friends. And when I listen to them, then they say that they talk about largely two reactions. One is saying that, well, online education is not too bad. But then some are saying that, well, it's so disappointing. And I think it really depends on how digital savvy they are. So if they are very digital savvy, then they say that, oh, it's very good. But then now if they're not really aware of the digital technology, then they say that they're very much disappointed in the school and also in their school education. And I think the corporate side, the businesses, and also it was mentioned earlier, yes, offline is still very much necessary. But then right now we have to reduce the portion of offline. So I believe that the question now is how we're going to maintain the balance between online and offline down the road. Yes, also Director Hong just made his remarks, but yes, I see that after COVID-19, the society itself is changing quite a lot in Korea. So we see that a lot of people are now enjoying their evenings with their family. So we see this as societal changes and then also cultural changes. So in a way, it is also pointing a new direction in the future for us. And also it is showing us a new transformation in a way. So then, Professor Shin, what do you think are the changes and the opportunities and the challenges COVID-19 is giving to us?
As a social scientist, I believe that's a very important question. So your question is related to labor and everyday life, as well as the relations between labor and leisure. I believe that due to COVID-19, the social classes have changed and the work-life balance will also change quite drastically, and we are already experiencing those changes. I believe that the starting point is what you have just mentioned, the gap and the hierarchy within our society. The COVID-19 situation is hitting different groups with different degrees. COVID-19 is related to risk and security, and it's a comprehensive risk. It's not just about health risks, but it's about mental health risk, labor risk, social relations risk, the ability to work. And so the virus has started these risks all across our lives and our society. And so the better off in this situation are safer from other aspects because they can work at home in untaxed ways and they are more protected from the loss of income and they are surrounded by loved ones at their safe homes. And so whether it be work-life balance and other aspects, they have a better situation because of COVID-19. But that's being enjoyed by just a few. Some are losing their jobs. Some are forced to take a leave without pay, or they have income loss. Some people are not at a situation where they are losing their jobs, but sometimes they are exposed to dangers. For example, the health workers, they're not losing their jobs, and the delivery workers are not losing their jobs, but they're more exposed to viruses. And so you can see that depending on which part of the social hierarchy you belong to, you are impacted in different ways. And digitization has infinite potential, but these potentials are not giving positive impact universally across the society. And so we need to take that into consideration. Thank you very much. Mr. Lim, my next question goes to you. In Singapore, I'm sure that COVID-19 poses many different challenges. What are some of the discussions that are happening within Singapore?
I think the most important is jobs. Right? All right. So like right now we are going to election. The election is this Friday. I think the biggest thing is how we're going to reinvent the job, prepare them for the future. Because one thing is that a lot of jobs will be lost. This is what our Prime Minister Lee Hsien-loong told us. Is every day in the news you can hear it. Is that a lot of jobs will be lost, and then a lot of businesses have to change the way they operate their business, and that requires the workers themselves to reinvent themselves. But how much they can reinvent, it depends really on age group. Yeah, the younger generation definitely they can do it. They can do it quite easily. But for those in mid career, that is the biggest problem. In fact, in the library itself, we do face this issue, and that is how our librarians are going to reinvent ourselves. We cannot continue the old model where librarians will just sit there and wait and do counter duties, wait for patrons, our users to come to us, and then we push out products. Push out books. Introduce books to them and things like that. But we have to reinvent ourselves, re-equip ourselves with new skills, and there we are talking things like it could easily enter into a different territory like programming, coding, and this is something that many of us are not familiar with. And how are we going to do it? Yeah, okay. There are many ways that we can overcome it. Definitely through training, but again, many of us are mid-career. We have been in libraries for a very long time, and how are we going to switch our mentality to do something that's more like a back end job to create a frontline service digitally? Yeah. So this is one example that I can give you.
Thank you. So jobs and inequality, these are negative impacts of COVID-19. Director Hong, can you talk to us about new possibilities? Well, I do believe that this is a possibility, but also a source of risk. If we take a look at 2019, the biggest issue of businesses is digital transformation. We all talked about who will lead digital transformation. We thought that the survival of the companies will pivot on digital transformation, and this has been accelerated with COVID-19. MS's chairman had mentioned that digital transformation was thought to take 2 years, but COVID-19 has shortened that to 2 months. So if companies will go through digital transformation, it will lead to differences in the industries. For example, the large distribution companies, they are dominating the market, and this will be accelerated in the future. And when industries become digitized, we also need to think about whether this will lead to job losses. It could also be an opportunity for some. With the advancement of digitization, risk is a very big issue. For example, the risk of job losses. I'm sure that in the last 2 to 3 years, all of a sudden you don't see many people working in parking lots. It's all been digitized. And so we need to think about upscaling our labor force. And that is a major task ahead of us with COVID-19. Thank you very much. The issue of jobs is not the only issue. COVID-19 also brings us to think about the environment. Professor Lee's pre-recorded presentation video talked about how environmental education is not just a matter of earth science, but it will be a part of how we should not hurt people's hearts and souls. And it's also about solidarity with others. So we need to think of ecological education on a larger scale. One concern that we have is that there are so many people who are worried about climate crisis, but we're still overwhelmed by the methodology of growth. And the ecological environment, sometimes we believe that it's just a plus on the mainstream flow of growth. Will that be a future direction for us?
Yes, I do. I do believe so. Now, COVID-19, now in the post-COVID era, how we are going to change, I don't think the question should be so reactive. It's about how we are going to change the world after COVID-19. So we have to change the question itself, how we are going to change this. And now, of course, in terms of the cause or the origin of COVID-19, I think there's a scientific consensus already. So climate change and the environmental destruction, and also the illegal trafficking of animal. So now these are also the common causes that have been observed for other zoonotic diseases, like SARS. So now then, yes, we have been hit with this poison arrow that is COVID-19, but where did this arrow come from? And that is from ecological destruction. So then, for this kind of ecological destruction or the climate change, then what have caused them? And that is coming from the forces that have been in domination for the past 200 years, and that is the belief in market power, that the market can do all. But then now it is giving rise to other issues like not only COVID-19, but then even the more serious issue as the climate change. Now then, if we are to abandon the notion of market dominance, then what kind of alternative can there be? So I believe that that is going to be the ecological environment. And I believe that perhaps that is not going to be easy, but then I believe that that should also be part of our education. And that is why I talked about ecological transformation with the Superintendent Cho. So it's not just about the ecological education just for the sake of education. I believe that it is one way of changing how our society works. And that is why, in terms of the ecological environment, if we are to change something, if we are to create something new, then ecological environment, can this become a core value? I do believe so. Yes, I do believe that no one would deny the importance of ecological education, but still, ecological education is just part of the curriculum, and perhaps it cannot be the new indicator in education. But then I wonder, in Denmark, what is ecological education like? How is it being held? So then, Mr. Mortensen, can you tell us about ecological education in Denmark?
Yes, I'm sitting and smiling just a little bit because it's almost embarrassing because it's not
덴마크에서의
it's not where it should be. I mean, there's so many other issues that the educational system addresses that this discussion seems very important. But I'm delighted that it's a part of the agenda and the discussion with you. But it's not something that we meet very much in the education system in Denmark. I'm sad to say, and a little bit embarrassed. That's why I'm grinning when I'm talking about it. And I think it has to do with the politicians' different stance on how is it market economy, or is it? It's an environment that is the most important thing. And as long as the decision makers and the politicians are discussing this and cannot make a agreement about how to address this, it seems like the schools and the people us around the schools are hesitant in pursuing a good approach, so that it could have an effect in all the education, and it should be. But I'm sad to say that's I can contribute to the discussion. Sorry.
Thank you. Well, that was an answer that was a little bit different from what we had expected. Superintendent Cho, you have a special interest for ecological education. What is the meaning of ecological education in Seoul? Well, Mr. Mortensen from Denmark had a grin on his face, and I don't know if I should be grinning or frowning, because we should be even more embarrassed about our situation compared to Denmark. I think we should be more embarrassed about our situation in Korea compared to Denmark. We are a late starter for ecological education, and we're also a late starter for economic development. And so we focused on growth. And so in this era of climate crisis, we need to make sure that we expand ecological education. We need to make sure that it's a part of the comprehensive education. We do have plans that we have announced recently. I think when we take a look at ecological education, we need to take a look at transformational education. I think we should approach ecological education from the perspective of transformational education. I don't know how well we can do this in the future, but we need a comprehensive approach. So if we take a look at global citizenship education and democratic education, ecological education should not just be an add-on, but it should be a part of the comprehensive education. And so it should not be one separate subject that students learn, but rather it should be mainstreamed into other subjects so that ecological education can become a part of all the subjects that students learn. And so we have a slogan. We say, from the cart to the solar energy. So that means that we want to make a zero carbon school. And so we can think of the macro school environment. And ecological education focuses on future generations, because in this era of climate crisis, we have the substantive goal of improving our environment. And in order to execute that goal, we need to make sure that the students become aware of ecological education. So from one aspect, we need to approach companies that create pollution, or cars that emit pollution, or companies that use fossil fuels such as coal. We need to have public regulations for the pollutants. And so by responding to these sources of pollution, we can change the actual reality. At the same time, we need to focus on the fact that ecological education should create changes in our everyday lives, unlike other subjects. So ecological education is not just about the other person doing well. So it's about, for example, using handkerchiefs instead of hand towels. Well, we are thinking of handing out a pretty piece of handkerchief to each student in Seoul. So rather than using hand towels or tissues, we can use handkerchiefs, which we did in the past. So we could have a campaign, for example, if you use a piece of hand paper towels, then you will kill a tree. And so we need to make sure that education actually changes the lives of our students. So it seems that we are at a point in time where we need to wrap up part 1. So let's try wrapping up part 1.
So now I would just like to raise a general question. So again, we see a lot of changes in our society after COVID-19. Now, what changes do you think will lead to the change of future education? Because I believe that the situation today is also causing changes in our education. So then, what do you think the changes should be for the future education? So Dr. Kwon first. Yes, regarding the changes in future education, I think Professor Hargreaves, now what he mentioned, I also agree with his assessment. And also what I was impressed with is that now listening to all the presentations, Professor Hong, he talked about learning with life and then also the fundamental changes in schools. I would say that these are the two major changes that we have to continue to address. And also, out of the education gap, what is more pronounced is the digital gap. So that is something that we also have to address. That means it also is upon the schools to think about what they can do in terms of digital education as well. So then it's not just about the online education, but also for the offline education, what we can do further. So regarding this, I believe that the sense of community, the spirit of community, and also the relationality, I think that they are going to be very important. And last but not least, now I'm not really knowledgeable about ecological education, but then now, if that is going to be one indicator of education in the future, then now for us to have the kind of ecological education today, given the status quo, rather than just maintaining the status quo, perhaps you can change it from the ground. So for example, maybe we can also change how schools work. So for example, small schools, or maybe having schools in small villages. Or all right, now then, how about Mr. Hong? Because I am in the field of edutech, let me approach this from that perspective. So I was thinking about what technology is going to be important, so IoT or VR, but I would like to emphasize two things. First is mobile. So because over 90% are focusing on mobile. Now, in the school, what we are doing now is only part of that. But then I believe that if we are to draw more students to the online education, then mobile, we have to utilize mobile more. Second is AI. So I believe that regarding AI, so I believe that we need to collect more data and to create the kind of content that would appeal to the students more. Now then, why don't I also raise the question to Mr. Lim in Singapore. So how do you think that COVID-19 is going to change our future education?
Okay. One thing is that we have to, okay, if we want to go online, okay, definitely this is impossible for us to go fully online. Okay, there have to be some offline traditional classroom setting learning. All right. In fact, our Minister of Education did say that although yes, home-based learning will be part of the curriculum in the future, but then school-based learning is still the most important thing, because that's where students socialize and where they learn all these soft skills and communication, things like that. That one cannot be taken away. All right, nothing can replace it. I can see the change in my child. Okay, when he gets to go back to school. All right, but we cannot just but for online learning, one thing that we observe in the library as well is that we cannot just give them digital worksheets. Okay, just a PDF form of any worksheets or any click-based online learning. It will work if it's required, but if you want to grab their interest, that's where you have to change how this product is packaged. And one thing is that, like, one thing Professor Hong did mention about things like micro learning and using new ways of repackaging learning materials like VR. That's one thing. Okay, if you want to reach out to the younger generation, one thing is to tap on all these new digital tools, VR. Another one, it will be story maps and things like that. And what the library is trying to do is trying to repackage all our traditional format materials, and then mix it with all our digitalized collection and repackage into very bite-sized, small snippets of information to be pushed out to the users, including students. In that way, you can grab their attention in that little short span of time, and from there, we hope that they can continue to explore and learn. So it's something that is lifelong learning. Okay, they take it, they got interested in it, they see some VR pictures of old Singapore, and hopefully they will continue to explore more and find out where can they find more of such photographs, or old maps or things like that. Yeah, that's it.
All right, thank you. And now I'm sure that Professor Shin would also be interested in this and would also have a lot of ideas regarding this. Yes, I would just like to mention three things. Now, although I am not an education expert, but as a sociologist, what I would like to say is that now in thinking about future education, we need to have a more integrated perspective. I believe that that is what we need today. Because in this COVID era, now there are a few keywords: risks, anxiety, uncertainty, unpredictability, and also a big gaps or disconnect, crisis. So these are the keywords, and they are not limited to only certain realms of the society, including infections and also health and income, education, jobs. So they are affecting all parts of our society. So we are seeing this huge chain of uncertainty in our society. And we are also seeing the impact in the field of education. So the students and the parents and the teachers. So in one way or another, they are going to have a huge impact on all of us, including education. So now then, thinking about future education, of course, technological innovation is going to be an important part, very important, but also as important is going to be the changes that will occur in other areas as well. So that is why I mentioned that we need to have an integrated approach. And also, as the public sector becomes more important these days, now we also have to think about the public's role. Now, in the past, the public education, the public schools, and also the public nurseries, so what they used to do in the past, now because of the need for non-face-to-face, now many of them are not fulfilling their functions up to the full. So then we need to fill that gap using some other tools or media, so media or some other ways. So I believe that they are also playing some public role. So we also have to think about what kind of impact this is going to have on the students. So for example, the media or the broadcasters or the other sectors. So we also have to think about the impact coming from them as well.
And Professor Lee? Well, I talked about how ecological education should be connected to educational principles. There are four important principles for ecological education. We need to look at people and nature as not as tools but goals themselves, and we need to make sure that there's no hierarchy of importance. We also need to learn that we are dependent on the environment as the environment is dependent on us. And we also need to have resilience, how to grow resilience. Just like we mentioned in the beginning, the ability to live together and the ability to survive are not contradictory, but rather they are reliant on each other. And on the other side, we have competitiveness. But when we think about competitiveness today, it's not about who we're going to beat, but it's about who we're going to live with and how we're going to survive on our own. So we need the ability of surviving and also living with others, but we always talked about competition. One last thing that I would like to mention is that in the Korean school system, why don't we ask the students, what do you think? Why do we always ask the students, what did Einstein think? What did the past kings of Korea thought? So they should not be remembering what other people have thought, but they need to think about what their thoughts are. We can't talk about how the future generation lacks creativity when we don't ask them what they think. And so we need to make sure that our students of the future are students that have their own thoughts, but that the students can also survive and also that they can live with others. Thank you very much. Well, Mr. Mortensen, what could you share with us your thoughts as a wrap-up?
Well, it's difficult to predict what is going to happen, but the School Leader Association is very. We think a lot about the human development, and the approach that we have today is somewhat restrictive. It's just when we try to support students in the development, it's of course it's skill based. But it's often a linear thought process. You should be able to do this at this point, and so on. And human development and the human skills is not a linear process. So how do we create systems and support the education system in a way that allows the students to be themselves? In Denmark, we are very big fan of a Danish word called dannelse. In German, it's Bildung. It's something about self-cultivation. It has to do with the relationship between the man and society. It's not about only skills and math skills. And so these abilities to have a good life, and we know some of the things from psychology and pedagogy, but how does we support that in the development in the school system that allows the students at different times to develop? We hope that this crisis also can put a perspective on education as a very complex process for the students. So these are the final thoughts from me.
We will now go back to Superintendent Cho for his remarks. I believe that within COVID-19, as a public institution, the Seoul Metropolitan Office of Education focuses on how to reduce gaps and inequalities because we are seeing the acceleration of gaps. So students from lower income groups, they're more exposed to infections. So through COVID-19, we can see the acceleration of many sorts of inequalities, especially inequalities in education. These are some of the issues that we are focusing on. And just like Mr. Mortensen has mentioned, we are moving into an era of blended education, combining online and offline education. We are not moving into an era of fully online education. We will not see schools disappearing. But rather, some people say when COVID-19 situation ends, we can go back to how things were before with fully offline education. I don't think that's appropriate. I think we're leading into an era of blended education. So we need to think about how we're going to blend our education. So we need to think about blended education, just like Mr. Mortensen has mentioned. There are domains where online education is more effective. And so we need to use online education where it is more appropriate and combine that with offline education where it is more appropriate. So we need to have strategies to teach and care for our students with a blended education approach. We need some areas where students need to gather within classrooms. For example, we need to develop our social skills, interpersonal skills, and cooperation by coming together in classrooms. So offline education is needed. So we need a blended education. So although it did come with its growth pain, we are moving into the era of blended education. We need to think about how to optimize education for our students. We need to focus on how each individual students can grow into their full potential. And we need to utilize the technologies that will enable this goal to become true. So those are the thoughts that we need to have on our minds as we move into the future. Thank you very much for your attention. Yes, thank you very much. Conducting part one, we think of the word present because it means now, it also means gift. I think we can see COVID-19 as a present from some aspects because there were issues that we have always put off, such as the climate crisis or inequality. We knew those issues were there, but we always put it off. But now, with COVID-19, we have an awareness that we need to take action now for these issues that we have always put off. Education has the power to create a world that we're living in. And so I think we can refocus on these issues. This brings us to the end of part one. We will take a short break and go into part two. Part two will focus more on school education. Thank you very much for your participation in part one. This brings us to the end of part one.
안녕하세요.
Good afternoon. We are looking at the changes post-COVID-19. Let us start part two of 2020 Seoul Education Webinar International. I am sure that many of you have participated in part one as well. During part one, we took a look at the overall changes in society. Part two will focus on public schools, what has changed, and what we expect in the future. For part two, we have 7 panelists. Let me introduce the panelists to you. We have Superintendent Hee-Yeon of Seoul Metropolitan Office of Education. We have Director Kim Hyun-sup of Class Design Research Institute. We have 2 teachers on site. We have Ms. Kang Yoon-ji of the Seoul Yangjin Elementary School. We have Ms. Kim Ju-yeon of the Yeongdeungpo High School of Seoul. We also have with us Dr. Chu Jung-un, Senior Research Fellow at the Seoul Educational Policy Institute. We have 2 international participants. One person is very familiar to the Korean audience. We have with us Ms. Taru Salminen from the University of Turku. We have seen her on Korean television quite often. Can you say hello to the Korean audience?
Yes, hello. I'm asked to speak English, so I will stick to English. Very nice to see you. I'm actually back in Korea for a couple of months now, just in self-quarantine here in the city of Jinju. I hope to see you in Seoul someday, like in July or August.
And we have with us research fellow Philip Vakar. He is at the United Nations University in Japan. Good afternoon.
Hello, my name is Philip Potter, and thank you very much for having me here today. I'm with United Nations University here in Tokyo.
Yes, research fellow Philip Vakar is working on SDGs and UN policies, especially related to education, curriculums, and environmental policies. So let us start part 2.
Now, online school. Now, for us, it has been unprecedented. It was quite a shock. Classrooms empty of students and schools empty of students was such a shock and really something new. So what has it been like for the past 5 years? So what did you think for the past 5 years? So perhaps Ms. Kang first. Yes, hello. I am from Yangjin Elementary School of Seoul. My name is Kang Yoon-ji. Now, first of all, now we need to, I'm sure that many people have heard and also seen in front of schools. Schools exist for you. Schools are here because of students. So we always say that. But then now, since COVID-19, there has been online education, online classrooms. So such a remote education has started in full. Now, under COVID-19, with such high unpredictability, so of course, teachers, students, and parents, they are all in confusion. Every day has been a struggle. So every day for a short time of online education, the teachers had to learn everything anew about the platform and also what kind of network, what kind of routine that we need. So we would also pick the network as well as the software. So we had to do everything all at once. And also, even as we were doing online education, the teachers themselves also had to go through training. So I think the teachers also had a very hard time trying to make adjustments. Not only that, but also we had to do some child care in the school. So there has been some added burden on the teachers. And oftentimes the instructions or the guidance from the education offices or the ministries were not forthcoming very quickly. So again, there were some confusions. Then also in the beginning, because of the server problems or the system problems, so there were a lot of complaints coming from the parents as well. So the teachers also had to deal with that. Then also for the online education, now we also had to check attendance or give out homework online as well. So that was also new. So of course, not only the teachers, but of course parents and also the students. Now, especially for the parents, I mean, they also had to make sure that they had the right system. So for them, it was not easy either. So it's been hard for everyone, especially so for the disadvantaged. Now we have both online and offline schooling at the same time. So now we see part of the student body every day. So now we feel that the schools are more alive now. But then we still have to take care of a lot of things. So for example, keeping the students at a distance and also about the lunch and also taking care of the students. So now we are feeling quite a big fatigue. Now, of course, the students are still saying that although we cannot get close to each other, we still like coming to classes. We still like coming to school. So we can sense their smiles behind their masks. So that makes us very happy. And I'm sure that many teachers feel the same. Right. So yes, I can really imagine the students smiling behind the masks. Now, what about Mr. Kim Ju-hyun? What do you think? Well, I can't even remember. It was all a blur because everything went by so fast. So now in 2017, we also had the earthquake. So we had a big crisis at that time already. And at that time, I thought that, wow, this is something new. I mean, it was a big disaster. But then now, this year with COVID-19, we can't even open up schools. And now we had to start with online education, and then now we also have the offline classes. But now again, I mean, the world has completely changed. I mean, I'm not that old, but then now I can see that, oh, it's for the first time in my life. So, and one more thing that I thought was that now when I was learning pedagogy, then they talk about Maslow, of course, now self-achievement or respect, very important, but first thing is safety. So because safety is no longer guaranteed, then it was very difficult for us to think about what to do next. So I'm sure that it was the same for elementary, middle, and high school as well. And also, on the other hand, I can feel that our spirit of citizenship was really good because the people were, I mean, we had this crisis, but then we were all cool-headed about this. And whenever the government gave instructions, then people would follow. So everyone was wearing masks. Of course, these days, people are more lax and loose, but still, I can see that people are really compliant. And now, about the teachers, now, I thought that the teachers, especially in high school, they were more like the reserve army. The reason why I say this is because, you know, when you are in the reserve army, then you see that many of the men are quite relaxed and, you know, trying to goof off. And I thought that, of course, there are such teachers like that now who are more lax. But then, now, because this crisis really was upon us, we really got to work and everything was ready in a week. So I could see that, you know, when things came to a push, then they really were ready and got things done. So, of course, in terms of the systems or the technologies, oftentimes you would have some problems. But still, I could see that we really had the spirit. And just one more thing. Again, coming back to the national spirit. So one of the news recently was about the riots in the U.S. and also in LA, and they say that the term roof Koreans came into being like a few decades ago during the LA riot. And that is because now, you know, they were just living their lives, but then they had this crisis, and then these Koreans went up to the roof armed in order to protect themselves and their families. And I think that is what we are seeing today among the teachers and the parents. Now, we also talk about the K quarantine, so to speak. And of course, yes, there was a competent government, but then along with the competent government, there were also the people who were also equally competent. And I would say that also the teachers who were at the front line as well.
I wonder what the experience of other countries were. My first question goes to Ms. Selmanen. What is the Finland school education like after COVID-19 currently?
Well, first, to introduce the situation a little, the schools in Finland, they were closed for 2 months, starting from mid-March until mid-May. And that was actually the end of the semester. So the situation was a bit different from the Korea, because you had the start of the semester, and we were at the end of the second semester already. And I have many teacher friends in different levels of schools, like elementary and also secondary school. And everybody was in shock for the first week. But after that, things went quite smoothly for the teachers, at least, because like in Korea, Finland is digitally very well prepared for this kind of thing. And we have already been using different kind of digital tools in teaching for a long time in the classroom. So of course it was a leap. We suddenly had to do everything online, but then it started going quite well. But then many teachers are parents themselves, and as all working parents, then you had to work from home. But then what do you do with your kids? I have two small kids, 1 year and 3-year-old, and they couldn't go to the kindergarten. And I have a very small apartment, just one big room, and then I have a sauna. So I went to the sauna and gave my lectures there, like every day. So, but it was a very short commute, which made it quite nice anyway. Anyway, so for the teachers, it went quite well. And as for the students, they were mostly enthusiastic at first to study at home. And that situation actually favored some students. For example, students who had maybe concentrated more on chatting with friends at school than studying, or also it worked well for some students who have some difficulties in concentration in a very in an environment with lots of students. And also for those being bullied, actually, they also that situation actually helped them to concentrate more on studying. However, in Finland, we have been carrying research and all kinds of polls all the time. As the time got by, the studying got harder for students because you need to have a lot of social emotional skills like resilience, self-direction, and also ability to plan one's day and concentrate. And of course, the parents have to help the students with this. And as for the public discussion in education in Finland, it has mostly focused on not on technical issues, but on the equality of students. Because the very core principle of the Finnish school system is to provide equal education to everyone, and thus to reduce the gap between students from different socio-economical backgrounds. So the government and the educators, teachers, they were actually very worried about the impact that distance learning would have on these students who might actually lag behind. And that's what the teachers I know also said. They immediately, when they were ordered to teach from home, they started thinking about those students who have problems at home or who cannot follow teaching. Oh, how can I care about them now? And of course, the research is still going on, but judging from now, the gap actually between students has widened and the polarization has increased. Because although the number of adults working remotely in Finland is the top in Europe, it's 60%, still many parents have to go outside to work, and then the children have to be alone during the school day because the grandparents cannot help, because in Finland, those that are over 70 were recommended not to meet anybody, like to be in a quarantine-like situation. And also then there are also families with problems like with alcohol or general life management, mental health problems, and the kids of those families have been the losers of this thing. So what's going to happen now? Finland is already preparing for fall, for the possible second wave of corona, but we have had quite good experiences from spring. The most important task that is left for us is to ensure enough support for those students who have lagged behind in teaching during this 2-month break in school.
Thank you.
That's all.
So the gap is definitely an issue in Korea and Finland as well. Why don't we go to Dr. Volter? So you are American living in Japan. So you could talk about Japanese education or American education. It's up to you.
I will just mention that in Japan, the situation's been quite similar to Korea and Finland. Teachers adapted quite well and quite fast. And that's actually been the situation globally, much faster than other sectors have adapted to the new reality under COVID. Teachers and educators have really done amazing work. Like my colleagues from Korea have said, like in 1 week, you went from, completely shifting your world to online. So really, I think what this has revealed, especially in the United States, is that our teachers are very responsive. But what's become apparent is that schools provide more services than just education. Like my colleague from Finland said, there are gaps emerging as the quarantine goes down. But even right away in the United States, what became quickly apparent was that parents relied on schools much more than they ever realized. In the United States, schools not only provide education for knowledge, but a lot of children, it's their source of nutrition. It's also essentially childcare. And without those things, a lot of families in the United States were not able to function. And so from a structural perspective, we see how important schools are, but whether or not that is going to change parents' perceptions, who are voters, remains to be seen. Parents for many years, when asked about priorities for the country in the United States, education and environment tend to be very low in their list. However, as we see from this situation, education plays a vital role for many American families. And so, like Finland, like Korea, and like Japan, in the United States, teachers reacted quite quickly. The big difference seems to be that American school systems have much higher expectations put on them for things like nutrition and mental health and daycare. And yet we don't seem to see a lot of awareness among parents and among citizens that these services are provided by schools. And then when they're taken away, rather than reflecting on this, unfortunately, we just see American parents demanding that schools reopen because they don't want to deal with the fact that we are under quarantine. We are dealing with some stressors. So I think one of the situations also in the United States that's so distressing is that even outside of COVID, there is very little strong centralization for education. While we have minimal standards in things like math and science, how schools operate and other curriculums are incredibly diverse. And those are left up to the 50 individual states and the territories, the 5. But then in addition to that, those powers are devolved to the district level. And so we saw not only differences among how states were responding, but within states as well. So for example, the state I'm from in Minnesota, they said they were going to close schools, but that situation didn't realize because parents needed daycare. And so the schools stayed open, especially for parents who had to go into work. So people that worked in grocery stores and pharmacies and hospitals and fire departments. And so it was really just a partial closure. And that created even more confusion for teachers because they had one set of children in the classroom, but then they were also responsible for the other around half of children that were learning online. So I think like Korea, Japan, and Finland, American teachers responded quite quickly and quite well. The big difference that we've really seen is from American parents and the American public in regards to responding to education and COVID.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting explanation. Yes, I believe that in Korea as well now, since COVID-19, yes, I believe that many people realize the importance of school lunches. So now then, for the superintendent as well, I'm sure that especially in the early days, I'm sure that you were losing sleep over this. So now for the Office of Education, what are we thinking? Yes, we have just heard about the cases in Finland and the US. Now, COVID-19 being a pandemic, yes, I can see that it really is. And also, as a result of that, a lot of issues are similar to each other. Now, the fact that I'm sure that in other countries as well, it was just every day was full of anxiety and crises and difficulties. But it is really such a strange epidemic, such a strange infectious disease. I mean, people are meant to be together, form a community, but now it is separating us, separating people from each other, breaking up community. And I was thinking, how can this be? But then I'm sure that many people also had similar thoughts. Now then, the question is how the society and how the state should respond, and also how education should respond to this. Now, in principle, what we needed was social distancing, so to keep people away from each other. So we needed this isolation policy. And then now, after a while, we switched to what we call distancing in everyday lives, meaning that we carry on our normal activities, including education, while still keeping distance. Now, for education, now in the early days of COVID-19, now when the COVID-19 task force were imposing the social distancing, of course, we had to follow that, and education was being held online. But now, because it is getting prolonged, then so in the very beginning it was broadcasted through the education broadcasting system, and then later on, now as it was getting prolonged, then we moved to online education, and then now as it was continuing, we can see that online education was now getting well established. And we also had to make sure that the students, 6 million students, had to receive the same quality of education. So now the Korean society is so keen on education that all the parents were demanding that their children receive the same quality of education. So we also had to make sure that we were doing that. So then afterwards, we started partially opening up schools. So the students, so not the entire student body, but then parts of the students would rotate going to school. So now we have the blended education now. So online and offline education. So if I may explain a little bit, the school system in Korea is different by elementary and the middle school and the high school. So for the high school students, now the third grade in high school, they go to school every day. But then now for the first and the second grade, one half of them go to school. So half of them rotate. And then for the middle school and the elementary school, it's 1/3. So 1/3 of the student body would go to school. So that is how we now have a blending of online and offline. And then in the course of this, we see that some schools start partially opening the schools, but then sometimes there could be a confirmed case out of the student body, then they would have to shut down the school again. So that is how we are alternating between the online and the offline education. But now, because this is an unprecedented crisis, we also had to roll out unprecedented and unimaginable policies. So, for example, among the 1 million students in Seoul, about 50,000 students in low-income classes, well, we had to make sure that there is no education gap, so no digital divide among them. So for these 50,000 students, then we would provide them with laptops and computers to make sure that they can also participate in the online education. So we also had to come up with these extraordinary measures to make sure that no one would be left behind in this era when we are now conducting online education.
Yes, we are faced with an unprecedented situation, and so we are trying to find creative solutions. Let us now go to Director Kim. From your perspective outside of the school, what do you see? Well, obviously, COVID-19 was unexpected. It's not been predicted by anyone. Just a year ago, no one predicted that we would have a full stop of public schools and that we would not be able to go to school and that we would have online education and then going to blended education in a short period of time. I think we moved very quickly through that process in a short amount of time. In that process, if we take a look at the response of the offices of education and also schools, there has been different responses and there has been gaps. I'm sure that the offices of education gave this a lot of thought. During the beginning, disease control regulations and social distancing rules were the focus so that we could control the disease. And so in the beginning, it was more about sending down rules related to disease control. But schools are spaces of learning. And so we needed to also talk about how we can improve learning experiences. A lot of rules were about what not to do, but we needed to also think about what to do to improve learning in this situation. And so at individual schools, it was left up to them to try and do their best in terms of learning. So up until now, the Korean schools moved according to the guidance of the offices of education, but now they found themselves in a situation where they had to come up with their own ways of teaching. And there's also gaps between schools. COVID-19, we see that experts say it will go on for half a year or even more. And so for individual schools, if they realize that it's not just a short-term issue, they already prepared to train their teachers, and some schools actually started online programs from March. And so for individual schools, such as private schools, some alternative schools, they responded very quickly, and they were ready to respond very quickly from early March. And there was discussions within schools, and they had discussions on, for example, real-time classes, and they talked about how to overcome the challenges of real-time classes. But some schools actually waited for the instructions of the offices of education, so they responded later compared to other schools. And depending on the size of the school, the response was different. And so sometimes we could see that there were gaps between schools in terms of speed and also in terms of the method of their response. And so through this process, we could see that the governance of the schools are very important. And these governance is also related to the freedom of their schooling, learning, and curriculums. And so we need to have democratic processes of discussions and decision-making so that we can find solutions. Schools that were equipped to do this responded better, and schools that were not equipped to do this did experience more difficulties. And so this incident, this situation left us with a lot of food for thought. Dr. Chu? Well, I would like to follow up on what Director Kim has mentioned. I think this is also related to educational administration. We have learned about foreign cases, and we can see that this COVID-19 is giving similar experiences in countries around the world. But is that the same for educational administration? Do we have similar educational administration experiences? I think there are some differences in terms of administration. Well, I'm an expert from outside of the school, and from that perspective, I could see that educational administration in Korea has certain characteristics that were highlighted because of COVID-19. Well, we have Superintendent Cho here with us. I also experienced the potential of possible changes in educational administration in Korea. In the beginning, there was strong control of the government, and we had very detailed guidelines from the government, for example, concerning disease control and how classes should be run. But if we have such detailed guidance, it could be better for control, and we have accountability at the central government, so that may be more comfortable for schools to deal with. But it's very difficult to come up with administration that is a one-size-fits-all for all schools. And we realized that as time went by. And so offices of education actually took bold action. For example, teachers, they were exempt from public paperwork so that they can control on classes and disease control. And schools, they also reduced what they thought to be traditional events at schools. And teachers, they experience smaller class sizes. And so they have smaller class sizes within their classroom because students take turns coming to school. And so we could see potentials in the changes in educational administration that are possible, that could be possible in the last 2 months, which was quite amazing. And so I could see the potential of educational administration in Korea. But I do have some questions on my mind. When COVID-19 ends, what will happen? In part 1, everyone talked about how we will not go back to the situation of before COVID-19. Having listened to part 1, I am hoping that educational administration will not go back to pre-COVID-19 era. I think many teachers also have this question on their minds. And questions also is about doubts. Some teachers doubt this. Some teachers say that we will go back to pre-COVID-19 in terms of administration. And so even if I try something new now, I think it will be worthless after COVID-19 is over. I think this is because of the lack of trust in educational administration that was built over time. May I add to this? Well, within the COVID-19 situation, this is a very exceptional situation. COVID-19 is an exceptional situation. So we are experiencing an exceptional situation, an exceptional disease. And so we are looking at exceptions that may be possible in our lives and at our schools. And currently, operations are happening in extraordinary ways because of these exceptional situations. So, as you have mentioned, we are seeing exceptional situations in educational administration, such as reducing events or exempting teachers from public paperwork. So we are experiencing an extraordinary educational administration, but this could become the norm in the future if we find that there are positive aspects. And I believe that the strengths that we find through this exceptional situation should be mainstreamed in the future. So we are going through a very painful situation, and maybe this painful situation is driving us to have glimpses of our future. And we can mainstream what we experience now as a part of our future. I would like to also add to this dialogue. Of course, we had the response of educational administration, but there are also gaps between teachers. Some teachers in the beginning were shocked, but they are trying to go through the situation as easily as possible. For example, just providing videos that are already available. Or there are other teachers who would be up all night creating their own lesson materials. And they would receive calls from their teachers, from their students all day, and they would call them day and night as if they're call center staff trying to make this meaningful for their students. So there's a large spectrum of teachers. And if we take a look at individual schools, although there are gaps between teachers, some of the better responding schools, they created teacher communities to share their know-hows and try to train and educate their teachers so that they can reduce the gap between teachers within the schools. And so we need to think about this gap between teachers as well. Maybe I can also interrupt here and add and I think this is a very important point in terms of exceptional situation. Within the school culture, there are some exceptionally dynamic situations. For example, teachers are in a crisis, and so they help each other. How are we going to do online programs? We always try to create groups of teachers to share information, to improve lessons, to make their activities more dynamic. And the older teachers, we wanted to enable them to learn from younger teachers. And we wanted to create these communities of learning within the teachers. But because of COVID-19, this exceptional situation has accelerated that process. How can we maintain this momentum even in the post-COVID-19 era? So I think I need to keep my comments there because I've taken up too much time. So Superintendent Cho, listening to you, I think we won't go back to the pre-COVID times.
All right, so we were talking about the past few months. Now let us talk about the future. So then, about the post-COVID-19 era. So now in the presentations, now especially Professor Hargreaves talked about big tech and public renewal. So I think the former, the big tech, I mean, it is a given. But then public renewal, it is something that needs efforts, conscious efforts, I believe. So then what do you think about these scenarios? And also, do you think there can be other scenarios that can be at play? So now perhaps I would like to ask Mr. Philip Vaught first.
Well, thank you. I think that both of these panoramas are critical, but they're certainly not the only ones. For big tech, yes, online learning is going to have a role to play in the future, as we saw in the first session. But I think there was a really good point made that we need to be responsive and not reactionary as we engage with online learning. As we've seen, even in the wealthiest countries, in the most wealthy societies, there is a digital divide. And, you know, one family with a smartphone between 7 people won't be able to have the same quality education as, you know, if each individual child has a laptop computer. I think another component, in addition to public renewal, that Professor Lee mentioned in session 1 was this idea of we really do need ecological education. And if we crouch that in global citizen education, as you do in Korea, or if we frame it as education for sustainable development, as they do in Japan and Britain, I really do think we need to focus on the relations of systems to each other, human systems, but also the Earth systems. As was mentioned, we have many ongoing crises in addition to COVID, the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, deforestation, ocean acidification, and we'll need multiple responses to solve these. And this disruption is an opportunity to bring that ecological education into schools' missions, but also into the mission of learning at large. For decades now, countries around the world, we've been producing brilliant physicists and engineers and economists. But if those physicists and mathematicians and economists are using up the world's resources faster than they can be replaced, how smart are they really? And I think we need to look carefully about how we create education systems especially in societies like the United States, where consumption is so part of the culture, and we need to look at a way to have critical action about not only knowing what climate change is, but how do we mitigate it and how do we adapt to it? I think that's kind of ecological education is critical moving forward, especially as we have more emergent diseases like COVID-19 has been. You know, there's the example in all these videos from the United States of, you know, these adults with MBAs from Ivy League schools, but they're refusing to use masks and yelling at the person serving them coffee. So I think we need to look at action competence for treating each other better as well as treating the earth better, in addition to those two panoramas brought up earlier.
All right, thank you. All right, now then, let us move on to the education and the evaluation. So now then, Mr. Kim talked about the school curriculum as well as the evaluation and the future direction. Now, I believe that COVID-19 could be a double-edged sword in school innovation, because we were talking about non-face-to-face situation. Because now the curriculum or the evaluation were done mostly face-to-face, but now in this non-face-to-face, it makes it much more difficult. And online education was just in a minor part, but now it is becoming playing a bigger role. So now then I would like to ask this question to Mr. Kim. So then, on the field of education, what kind of changes are being made by COVID-19 in the curriculum as well as the evaluation? Well then, on the field now, as other teachers and also the international guests have mentioned, I believe that we are going through similar changes to that. But then, the question is, what they mean for each of us, and how are we going to see the changes or how we respond to them in the future. So instead of thinking about how we should respond to COVID-19, I think we should come back to the fundamental question of the role of education. Because now looking at the education in Korea in the past, then what I have felt the most were like giving scores or ranking students and just unilaterally delivering knowledge. So, and if they excel in this, then they can become elite in the society. If not, then they fall behind. So I have seen this so many times, but then I think perhaps COVID-19 can change this from the core. Now, on my way here, I read an article, and in this article, some parents said that now schools are not just about feeding them or washing them, but then it's also about socializing them to become social beings in the future. So once again, I realized that schools were really playing roles that the parents were not able to play. So for example, socializing the students. So it was the parents' remark. So then we still have to think about what direction should the schools be headed in the future. But then I thought that if it is going to be the same old, then we don't need that anymore. Now, of course, I myself am a teacher, but just unilateral delivery of knowledge, if we are to say that that is what schools are all about, then, well, many teachers today are actually playing the EBS programs to the students. And I thought about why. Now, they would play EBS programs to these students because now they can, so in the EBS programs, they have proven teachers and proven curriculum. And otherwise, so if they are to do something else, then they had to go through a vetting process. And another reason is now they lose out to private education. So then also likely to EBS as well. But then now, is that what schools are all about? So are there other values that the schools can give? And I believe what is important is to instill a certain attitude among the students. So we have to think about what we need to do in order to instill this right kind of attitude. And so, for example, the knowledge delivering knowledge can be done by private education. I mean, there are such excellent lecturers in private education. But then, when it comes to instilling the right mindset and the right attitude, then we need schools, teachers, parents, everyone involved. And now I have said too much already, but now I would just like to explain a bit about the kind of education that I had been doing for some time. And that is because I wanted to make some changes. So we have included programs for developing empathy to others and also to trigger more creative thinking among the students. And then based on that, they would also do their self-studies, and everything had to be recorded in the online site. So after doing such classes, then it's not just the classes that have changed, but also the way of evaluation. So we also had to change the method of evaluation altogether. So for example, the portfolio page in the online world, so it would be shared among the students. I would also evaluate it, and it would also be shared with students in other classes as well. Oh, so it's like peer review, yes. So we can also expand this to other classes as well. Now for me, what hurt the most was because of the changes in the evaluation method in schools. Now many complain that there is no objectivity anymore. But then we opened this up to other classes, and now there are about 180 students in one grade, and about 150 other students can grade and evaluate my students' coursework. So in the past, I would spend a lot of hours to grade them and to do evaluation, but still I would get complaints from my students. They would say, well, I think I did better than this. But then now it was last year that I just opened it up to everyone, and then no one came to me to complain. So this actually makes it more objective, I think. So what I had thought was that, yes, what the students come to school for is to build relations and to communicate, which cannot be done by online education. So I believe that we still need this kind of offline relationships, offline interactions, and then maybe we can use the online method to do some evaluation and sharing of the evaluation. Perhaps we can stop there, all right?
Would you like to add to your presentation if there's anything to add? I think classes in the future will be about asking questions, expressing what they have learned. And so the online classes these days are about delivering information and knowledge, so that has its limitations. So we need to have a new approach. What's possible because it's online? For example, developing a new game using Google Classroom platform or having online collaboration projects. So we need to take a look at what's possible because it's online. Well, in Korea, we have a great digital platform, but many people believe that we are behind in terms of utilizing digital platforms in classrooms and that teachers are hesitant to use digital devices. So what are the reasons and what are some of the possible changes in the future? Maybe Ms. Kang, you can share with us what you're doing. Well, one of the reasons why we are behind in using digital devices is because although we have a good digital IT platform, it's not so at schools. Before COVID-19, there were some schools that did not have Wi-Fi. Even if they are provided with Wi-Fi, sometimes it was not enough for all of the classrooms. And so many students could not enjoy IT platforms at schools. Because of COVID-19, such physical environments have been improved drastically. And so one teacher that I know mentioned that for several years she has asked for budgets, but she received that budget in just a few days because of COVID-19. And so she's very glad that this has happened. And so establishing such an environment, I think, is very important for schools. And along with infrastructure, we need to take a look at the school environment. And we also need to take a look at the information policies being applied to schools. Of course, within the Seoul Metropolitan Office of Education, there are different districts, and each district has different policies for information sharing. But for example, if teachers and students wish to share information, we have to go through external servers. And if that is not allowed in the information sharing policies of that district, that was very difficult to get around. But I think we have some flexibility related to these policies because of COVID-19. So we are more free to use servers outside the schools. And so teachers are hoping that we could continue to use these devices even after COVID-19 so that we can continue with blended education into the future. And concerning the utilization of digital devices, you mentioned the word hesitant in your question. I'm reluctant to use that word because it may be related to digital literacy of the teachers, but we have great materials and training for the teachers. But I think now we find it a necessity for teachers. We find that this is very important for their students. And so in the past, it was just a matter of going through mandatory training. And so it was very difficult to have voluntary participation. But now, because of COVID-19, we are driven into a situation where we have practically no choice but to participate in this training. And we now understand that this is the future. And so, although there are some limitations in distance learning, I think there are some positive aspects that we can incorporate in the long run for school education. That is the hope that we have on the part of teachers. Dr. Chu, do you have any other opinions? Well, in our everyday lives, we use digital devices very easily and very actively, but it seems that we're not so active in using such devices within the classroom. And so I think that's the part of the question. Well, I think we should take a look at the fundamental characteristics. If we take a look at public schools, the fundamental aspects of public schooling is not appropriate for digitization because we have a framework and public schooling always wants to maintain that framework. One of those framework is the boundary between subjects or the curriculum or the methods of testing or days of schooling or the rules for teachers. We have this strong framework for public schooling, and that makes public schooling a very strong institution. Compared to that, if we take a look at the fundamental characteristics of digitization, it's about hyperlinks. And so there's no start and finish. There is no beginning and end. And so it is out in the open without a framework, and it has no boundaries. And rationality does not function within digitization. If we take a look at relationships, the relationships within institutions and the relationships within digital platforms are different. If we take a look at VR or holograms, the way that we exist as a person is very different in the digital world. And so because the two domains are very different, the stronger the institution, the more difficult it is for digital to become a part of that. ICT, digitization, informatization, digital textbooks, these were attempts that have been made. But when they were incorporated into this strong institution of schools, it felt very awkward. And it's very difficult for students and teachers to be interested in these aspects for a long periods of time. So we tried to mimic digitization and we tried to train teachers related to digitization. It did not last. And so the more flexible our institutions become, the easier it will be for digitization to make a soft landing into our schools. And so this issue of framework is very important. And in terms of forecast, we have to focus on online learning. Online education, if we pursue that in the strong framework of schools, will that be the appropriate way? Or will we loosen institutionalization and incorporate digitization to open new opportunities for online learning. So we have to think in both aspects. So that is the perspective that I have.
Well, then what Dr. Cho just mentioned, I think we really need to set aside more time to think more about this. Now, we are also curious about the situation in other countries. So now this question is to Daru. Now, Finland, now for the PISA test by the OECD. So now for this, I would say that Finland has become the international standard for education. But then now in Finland as well, COVID-19, has it brought any impact or changes to education, and how are teachers responding to them? And also as she prepares her response, and then also, what do we call this? COVID-19 or COVID-19 or Corona-19 or Corona-19? So I think in other countries, I think they call this COVID-19, but in Korea, we call this Corona-19. So I think it's only Mr. Kim who is calling this COVID-19, but anyways. All right, so yes, Taru, are you ready?
Yes, in Finland we call it just the coronavirus. Yeah, so similar to Korean, just corona, something like that. Yeah, well, a very good question. And I listened to your discussion with great interest. Superintendent Cho and Professor Chu, you were talking about the administration, education administration. Well, and also I watched the presentation by Director Kim Hyun yesterday about and he was also talking about autonomy. How autonomy will be increased and needs to be increased. Well, Finland is actually already known for the lightness of administration. The teachers, they don't have much paperwork. Nobody tells them from above that, oh, you have to teach this, you have to do like this. Nobody. The national curriculum, it provides only the goals and the content, but the ways of the teaching or the materials, the teachers, they can they can decide by themselves. So this has actually been an enormous plus in this corona situation, because the teachers, they are very used to, they take responsibility of their work, and they are very well trained professionals. So the parents also trust them. So I think trust is very important in this aspect. However, many teachers have reported huge workloads. I'm sure in Korea too, like my workload, although it became two or three times more like normal. And now, according to a recent poll, about 10% of teachers in elementary and secondary schools, they answered in a survey that they are not enthusiastic about their work anymore. And so there is a downside to this autonomy as well. And the parents have reported that some teachers, they maintained contact with students on a daily basis, every day, almost like they were at school. But then some teachers are not that familiar with the digital tools. Then they sometimes just uploaded a list of tasks to the online platform, and that's it. So in Finland, they have been talking that maybe the equality that is so important to the Finnish system, it may have been compromised because of this autonomy in this case. However, there has been, and still in summer, lots of education for teachers, and also I'm sure in Korea too, the cooperation between teachers of the same subject in one school is very important. So in Finland, many teachers, they have formed these networks where they have been creating online content that they can use all, so that not everybody has to do the same thing by themselves. So and also blended learning is probably going to continue from now on. Of course, maybe not. It has been talked that in elementary school, the teacher is still kind of a mom or dad to the pupils. So although all the first graders in Finland, they receive a tablet and they use a lot of problem-based learning and phenomenon-based learning, also starting from the elementary school. Still, this school environment is very important for them. But going further up in the ladder, like to the upper secondary school, universities, of course, the blended learning will probably become the new norm. New norm, that is what is being said at the moment. And as I talked before about the equality, now the Finnish system is preparing to give more support to the students who need it in fall, because the Finnish academic year starts in August, in the beginning of mid of August. So they are preparing for this already. And one thing that is actually, I'm not sure about the thing in the situation in Korea. In Finland, legislation in the law concerning education, it said that the teaching has to be given as contact teaching mainly. But during the spring, we had a special law called the preparedness law, which gave the government wider powers to do something else than in normal circumstances. But the law has already ended, so now they are preparing very many changes in the legislation so that this online learning, distance learning could also be used as the new normal in the future as well. So that's about it.
Thank you. So autonomy on one side is very effective in making the situation very flexible, but at the same time, it could hurt in partiality. So Dr. Forte, whether it be the US or Japan, in the post-COVID-19 era, especially focusing on classes, what do you believe will be the changes?
Well, thank you for the question. I think whether it's Japan or the US or Korea or anywhere in the world, we are going to need to see a shift from avoiding risk or ignoring risk to one of managing risk when it comes to COVID. This is very similar to how schools and classrooms have dealt with issues like earthquake safety or tsunami or fire or any other disaster. We unfortunately do not live in a risk-free world. And so I think the biggest changes we will see is these first 6 months, especially in societies like the US, we had a very dichotomous response. Korea and Japan had a much more measured response for schools, but in the US, it was either ignoring the fact that the virus was there or complete panic and asking children and families to stay in their houses, basically with no timeline indefinitely. And neither of those responses is tenable for anyone. We can't ignore the virus, but nor can we just lock ourselves in with our nuclear families for months on end. So I think the biggest things we will see is, like other situations before, is we will need to simply move to one of managed risk. And I'm heartened because school systems and societies at large here in the Pacific Basin, so Korea, Japan, Vietnam, the Philippines, have taken a lot of proactivity on managing risk in their schools, whether that's been disease or nutrition, but also with natural disasters. And I think this will be a challenge for societies and school systems like those in the US that have a very polarized fight or freeze mentality, where they either want to ignore the problem or halt all activity because of the problem. But neither of those responses is appropriate in this case. So like what we saw with HIV in the 1990s, I think we need to move to a model of managed risk in classrooms where people have pertinent information and all the precautions are taken, but life will need to go on at some point. And as we discussed, online learning will play a part in that, but it's no substitution for the important socialization and psychological benefits of having schools. And so having schools where we manage risks rather than completely avoiding risk or ignoring risk, I think is the most important thing moving forward for classrooms around the globe.
Thank you. During our discussion, we have had questions from our audience, and one of the questions was, there are so many things that we need to do other than classes. For example, we need to deal with gaps among families, and how are we going to deal with childcare? My question goes to Dr. Chu. Other than classes, what other issues are there for schools triggered by COVID-19? Well, I think we discussed this in part 1 and 2. We need to talk about gaps, the gap between classes, the gap between schools, the gap between digital literacy, the gap between responses of schools. All of this is related to framework that I mentioned. I mentioned framework when I talked about institutions. We need to change our perspective. I think that's important. And when we take a look at childcare, what was childcare according to our definition up until now? We need to think about the form of childcare that we need. In the past, maybe it was about passing on our responsibility, but now we need to think about trusting each other in terms of childcare. Of course, there are parts that need to be done by families, but there are also things that schools can do. So we need to recognize the function of schools along with childcare. So we need to redesign the fundamental role of schools. If we try to include too much, schools will be overloaded. And so I think we need to think about the role of schools in a new way. So this issue of gaps. Due to COVID-19, we talked about how to restore the situation. And this word restore is about reflecting on what we have done thus far. We have to take a look at the fundamentals. What is education in its essence? We talked about classes and how the top 1 or 2 teachers could do all of the classes for everyone across the country. But would that be right? We need to think about the fundamental issues of childcare and educational administration. This pandemic is a disaster, it's a tragedy, but at the same time, it's a turning point for all of us. And that's probably why we have this discussion today. And we have a lot of food for thought.
So now let us move on to the last topic. So now then, Corona-19. So now then, after Corona-19, we see that schools are changing quite a lot. And I think they should, even more, down the road. Now then, schools in the future, what are they going to look like? And what should they look like? How should we shape them? So there can also be some expectations. So now let us end our discussion with that topic. Now, because of the time, I would just like to ask everyone to be brief. No, so now first, Mr. Kim. Well, I would say that it comes down to people's role, or how should people's role change? Because schools, what do they have to do to change people's thoughts and people's mindset? So I think that is one question that we have to keep in mind. And as the superintendent has mentioned, there is going to be a blended form of education, and also there are going to be realms that are specific and exclusive to the school. So we have to keep identifying the exclusive domains of school so that we can keep delivering them to the students. Yes, and also Mr. Kim Young-sup. Yes, I think if we can utilize blended learning better, then even if we have offline education, we can alternate between offline and online. So I think we can also allow students to stay home for education as well, if necessary. Then also for example, listening to the lectures again, even in high school, we can have that as well, just like in universities. So we can also have the students review the materials. So I think the online portion is going to make schools more flexible. Then also for the schools, I believe, are going to develop into something like a network. And of course, depending on the level of schools, it is going to be different. So depending on whether it is primary school or middle school or high school. But I think the character building or character education, that is also going to become an important part of school education, because that is going to be possible only through contact education. So the character building or the character education is going to be the role of the schools, but then also depending on the characteristics of the students and also the schools that are also going to be different. So I think depending on the nature of the schools, now they're going to be different. Now, also the same question to Taru, what should the schools look like in the future?
Yes, I agree that networks are crucial to the future schools, and I also agree with Professor Chu what Professor Chu was talking about gaps in skills of the students and backgrounds and so on. So it is a matter of how to ensure equality in education, and also I think all of the associated people, like not only teachers but also parents and also administration, they also have to think about different kind of skills than just studying. I mean, I mentioned briefly before about the social emotional skills, like being able to make oneself study, to have the ability to plan one's day. Unfortunately, there are big gaps between students in these kind of very crucial skills. So I think the school needs to think about what these kind of crucial skills everybody should have are, and also support the students as well as they can in them. And also this is related to the matter of mental well-being, mental health, because this situation has been very hard on many people. Those who have had hardships have had even more of them nowadays, and those who haven't have had a quite very big task, lots of hardships as well. So how to support the students and parents and schools to work together towards the common goal.
All right, thank you. And also Professor Philip Votter, if you could also provide your response.
What will the future of schools look like? This is a really good question, and I think one that societies around the world are struggling with, because we have this moment where there's been a disruption, and we can now use this to create societies that we think are more sustainable, are more fair, are more ethical. So I think we will see school systems responding to this, especially school systems with such proactive teachers like Korea and Finland. One thing I do think we need to be aware of, though, is we can't put all of the shoulder of responsibility on schools. I think schools have been so proactive and taking initiative about responding to COVID and moving online and trying to make sure education continues. But learning doesn't just occur in schools. And so I think we need other parts of society to remember that learning never stops. And so what I'd like to see is schools, and hopefully we'll see, is schools reminding adult society around the world that there's still learning to do. And whether that's through community partnerships with surrounding community, whether that's linking up with other parts of the world through multilateralism online, whether that's linking with university classrooms or local government. I think the future of schools is not only to educate youth, but for youth and teachers to remind society that, you know, learning never stops. What worked in the 1980s might not work now. And so we always need to relearn and adapt. And I think that's an important discussion, because even though we can't drag many adults back to school, schools can be beacons about what learning still needs to occur. And especially around issues like ecological education and sustainability, there's a lot that adults need to learn. And we don't want to put all of that responsibility on teachers and kids. We need to take adults to have some of that responsibility as citizens. So I'm hoping schools can be a starting spot, but they won't have to do all the heavy lifting on their own.
We will go back to Ms. Kang for her short comments. Well, I can relate to what everyone is saying. Because of COVID-19, we realize once again that the future is unpredictable. Schools are educating students who will live this unpredictable future, so we need to prepare them and guide them in their learning. And within the classroom, we have a wider variety of students. And this diversity of students represents a diversity of the future. And so for these students, we need to be able to accommodate to their needs. And I think it should happen more in the future so that we can accommodate closer to the needs of the students. And we need to utilize edutech. And we also realize the importance of actual presence in the classroom as we do distance learning. And so we need to blend the two so that we can work on character building of the students and work on their emotional aspects as well. Yes, thank you very much. Dr. Chu, for your short comments. Future education. Well, predicting future education inevitably includes online learning. Up until now, it seems that we were adjusted to online learning, but it's the first time it's become an actual part of our lives. So it's a massive experiment that is ongoing. We need to have deep thoughts about what online learning is. What is a good class? And I think that can continue into online learning. Blended learning is not only blending online and offline, but it's a blending of many different things. And so blending can happen in various layers. In part 1, we talked about ecological education. And so all of these various aspects should be blended into our education. We're just at the starting point to think about this. And at the center should be teachers. And so teachers should never be excluded. Rather, they should be at the center when we think about blended learning. And we need to design the future of schools with teachers at the center. I have high hopes for the future. Superintendent Cho? Well, I have participated in the discussion from part 1, and many people have made great comments throughout part 1 and part 2. I'm sure that it was inspiring to our audience. Schools of the past, schools of the present, and schools of the future, are things that do not change, and there are things that continue to change. I always love this statement. God has provided people with the power to love and think. I think education is indeed a way to empower people to think better, to love more. And it's a way of teaching to think more abundantly. And if we take a look at the environment, the technological aspects of education, that may change, although the fundamentals of education will always remain true. Just like Dr. Hargreaves has mentioned, and just like Dr. Hong has mentioned, we need to make our teaching richer. That is what we need to do. Just because we go to an online platform, it doesn't mean that we'll stop teaching. The environment will continue to change. We can go through the era of blended learning. How can we enrich our teaching in blended learning? How can we teach our students to love more and to think more? And just like Dr. Kim has mentioned, how can we accommodate to the needs of our students? It's not just about winning. It's not just about competing. We need to teach our students to cooperate and collaborate. That really is the task at hand for all of us. And many people have mentioned this, educational gaps, the digital divide. These are age-old issues that have become more serious recently due to COVID-19. So we need to overcome these issues together. We need to make efforts together. And I've already mentioned this on other occasions. Doctors and nurses of Korea, they are the heroes of this era. And at the same time, teachers who were able to move to online classes in just 2 weeks, that was quite amazing. So teachers are the hidden heroes in this era. They have achieved this impossible feat. Not only the teachers in Korea, but teachers around the world. Well, I think Korean teachers probably did the best. I really believe so. So this is a great sacrifice on their part. I hope that we can work together to overcome these challenges together. Thank you very much. So we have opened our schools in the online platform. We're almost at the end of the semester. Unfortunately, we believe that the situation will continue into the second semester. But for the first semester, we weren't ready to meet this situation. But in the second semester, I believe that we will be much more ready to take on this challenge. Through the discussion today, we realize the pandemic that we are faced with. And we have quite a universal challenge around the world related to education. The teachers of Seoul, the teachers of Korea, the teachers of the world, I hope that you will be able to overcome this challenge together. And this brings us to the end of the 2020 Seoul Education Webinar International. Thank you to our 7 panelists and also to our audience. Thank you very much.